Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us tonight a dual persona. We have Haldane B. Doyle, who writes fiction, and then we also have Shane Simonson, who writes nonfiction. And so we're going to be delving into both of his split personalities. I'm sure they're incredibly different people from each other. But before we go into your writing a little bit, Shane/Haldane, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I am a biology nerd from way back, from my very earliest days. I did a research science degree in biochemistry. Found that to be a little bit of an escalator to nowhere, so I jumped ship and was a teacher for a while. And that was just enough to buy my experimental farm. So I've retired relatively early in life to be an experimental farmer. And that's afforded me the time to do some writing on the side. So it's a really mixed up, strange path that I've gone down, but it's a very satisfying one.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to talk about your experimental farm, but let's put that on pause for a moment and talk about our vitreous womb. Mm-hmm. You have tagged this as a series of four hard science fiction novellas that explores a distant post-industrial future, one where purely biological technology has transformed the planet. So, where did you come up with this crazy idea?
Well, I love biology and I love sci-fi that features biology. So some recent examples would be Oryx and Crate or Adrian Tchaikovsky's The Children of Time trilogy. They were great, but it was still a little bit of biology on top of the mechanical technology that is kind of the staple of sci-fi. And it got me wondering, it's like, could you make a sci-fi where there is no traditional technology as we think of it, and you created a world that actually worked purely based on biology? And the closest I can think of is maybe the Xenogenesis Chronicles, but that's alien biology. So it's kind of just space magic tentacles. You can do whatever you want. No one can tell you whether the aliens can or can't do a particular thing. But when you limit yourself to Earth-based biology, it sets up really interesting constraints. And I really enjoyed that puzzle of building a whole new civilization on pure biology.
Yeah, so you mentioned Earth-based biology. Is this strictly human biology, or are you pulling from other species and bacteria and viruses and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the humans are the core of the story and the society, but they tap into every organism that they can get their hands on to put to every purpose that you can imagine. So yeah, it's very, very
And
fun.
what are some examples of this technology?
Let me think of one. Got to come up with a good one. Well, one that's really, really fun. So the humans that live along the coast are starting to dominate the marine ecosystems by having these giant groper fish. So gropers are an omnivore. They'll eat anything. So during the daytime, the gropers swim into channels along the coast that the humans have constructed into like ponds, where they get fed crops from the mainland. And that allows them to build up such a huge population that they eat everything else in the ocean that comes close to the shore. So it's a way for the humans to start, dominating and taking over that marine ecosystem.
Okay. And do you have any sort of space travel technology as well, or is this an Earth-bound civilization?
The series up to this point is purely Earthbound. I do have 3 more novellas outlined to finish the series that do end up with life moving into space. But that's something I've got to find the energy to come back to and write.
Gotcha.
But I will premise that the first 4 installments do end at a satisfying conclusion. You're not left with an absolute cliffhanger. So yeah,
okay.
If people are interested in it, don't delay until I write the next 3 bits of it.
So you did mention that there were 4 novellas, and how long are each of those novellas?
Well, technically speaking, each one is just over 40,000 words, which if you look, the definitions are fuzzy with these things, but most people say 40,000 words up is a novel, but you very, very rarely see any works from the 40 to 50,000 word range. They're usually considerably smaller, and they're definitely a novella or a short story, or they're like 60,000 words up. So there's this weird no man's land that it just seemed like ripe territory for a kind of storytelling that not many people had tried. And the people who've read the novellas say that each one has each one feels like it has a novel's worth of ideas, but in like half the word count. Because I just love getting to the point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up the size thing. And I guess that kind of leads me into my next question as far as the development of the novellas as they progress through the series. Is this are they continuation of each other? The first continues to the second, etc., or are they different perspectives of the same story? Or walk me through that.
Both. So it's a really interesting structure. So there is a single character who ties all four books together, but they are a secondary perspective in each of those stories. So each book has its own unique POV, but this recurring secondary character, it's basically the story of their entire life from cradle to grave, told through the eyes of four important people in their life.
Okay, interesting. And is there any self-adaptation, I guess we could call it? Are people changing their own genetics in this technology, or are they just harnessing what they have around them?
No, absolutely, absolutely. But one of the most crucial things about the society is that they've fully embraced human, I guess you would call it selective breeding, but there's sprinkles of low-tech genetic engineering as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Would you say that they're still humans?
Well, they can still reproduce with humans. So by the biological species concept, they're mostly human, according to that definition. I mean, species is such a flawed concept in many ways, and this is through my experimental farming work as well. I look at planet Earth as only having four species, A, T, C, and G, and everything else is just combinations of those four bases.
Interesting how you put that. Okay. Do they manage to do any sort of computation with this biological technology, any biological computers, so to speak, or are they very quote unquote low tech in that regard?
Yeah, no, I would call them post-rationalist, but they do have specialized lineages of people who function as, you know how honey ants store sugar in their bodies for an ant nest? These are the informational equivalent. They're basically a living archive of people who serve as the memory for the wider community.
Would you say that this is the next step towards a sort of Borg hive mind then?
I think of it more as a planetary superorganism. But in many ways, humans, modern humans, have already been a superorganism for like the last 50,000 years. Because unlike Neanderthals and other hominins that came before us, we engage in friendly trade relationships with our neighboring tribes. We're not as aggressive and fearful of them. And in like ancient times, like Stone Age, you see like obsidian being mined in one location, turning up thousands of kilometers away in the form of arrowheads because people have been swapping it hand to hand. And yeah, we've already been a superorganism. It's nothing completely new. This is just a refinement and extension of that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Walk me through real quick what some of your conflicts in the novels.
Oh, okay. Let me think. So the first perspective is from somebody who really doesn't know what's going on, and they have various ideas about their place in the world, and they figure out that none of that was true by the end of their installment. The second one is a character who is one of the more, supposedly evolved humans, but they have retained their lineage has retained ancestral traits, so they're constantly struggling with their own capacity for aggression, which they see as kind of primitive and undesirable, and also with their capacity for love versus disconnection.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, see, I can continue with the other two books, but the general idea is that this is a utopia in many ways. There's no disease, there's no hunger, there's no war. Like pretty much everything is perfect, but people's individual wants and desires are very much given over to the collective. So if you happen to be an individual who doesn't fit perfectly with your place in this utopia, that's where the conflict arises. And most of the characters are people who didn't quite fit the role that was assigned for them, but they managed to find another way to live their life.
Interesting. I really like that concept. And I think technology and people's place in society, both as separate concepts and the duality of concept, are kind of a hot topic right now. So what messages would you say that you're trying to give to your reader?
Well, see, I love science fiction, but I'm also very skeptical about the durability of industrial civilization. Like, we're undermining our foundations on so many levels, and there's doom and gloom, and it's all going to go back to Mad Max and Stone Age, and I'm like, that's, or we're going to hit some magic technology and it's going to be Star Trek and post scarcity, colonize the whole galaxy tomorrow kind of business. And I found it really boring that they were the two alternatives that science fiction presents to us. Like, is that the only options on the menu? And it got me thinking of it, like, what are the only truly renewable resources on planet Earth? And biology is one of them, and the other one is human culture. So I wanted to try and take those two ingredients and paint a picture of a third kind of future that could be waiting for humanity, and one that's completely plausible. It doesn't rely on any technology being like pulled out of. See, here's the thing: like, our dreams of colonizing space, if you actually look at the science that says there is no way to travel faster than the speed of light, and even approaching it is really difficult and dangerous for squishy organisms like us, and any other planet that might be habitable is so incredibly far away that we're not going to get there without like just completely breaking the laws of physics. And the science fiction people are like, I love science, I love science. They put their fingers in their ears and go, la, 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 la. We don't want to hear any of that. We want to keep dreaming about this, 100-year-old story that we told ourselves that we've since figured out probably isn't going to happen. Like, even Mars probably isn't going to happen if you look at the science. So science fiction, the utopian, like, high-tech version of it, I think is very much a power fantasy. It's kind of a wish fulfillment thing. It's more fantastical than fire-breathing dragons.
Yeah, well, I think now that you've outlined all of that, I think it's very interesting that you still managed to find a utopia in face of this terrifying future of solitude that we may have ahead of us.
Oh, the solitudes today. I mean, look at the loneliness statistics for people who are like just, their main way of interfacing with the world is through TikTok videos of, minor celebrities that wouldn't know them from a bar of soap. So if anything, this future is a much more connected one because everybody has a place in a community. It's just not everyone perfectly agrees with what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's our tradition in writing fiction. There has to be a conflict to make it an interesting story.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple minutes ago you said something that was a great segue into the next point, which would be your nonfiction writing. So you mentioned a sustainable future, and you mentioned you're doing a sustainable farming now. So tell me about that.
Okay, so the kind of farming I do, I call zero input agriculture, and I have a weekly Substack that's been going for quite some time where I just talk about different experiments that I'm doing. Well, usually results. I like to focus on things I've actually done, and I sometimes review books or philosophize once in a blue moon. Occasionally, a little bit of short fiction, just to keep my my senses tuned there. And basically what I do is, rather than changing the environment to suit the plants that I want to grow, I change the plants to suit the environment. So that involves like growing 30 different varieties of tomato, not watering them, not fertilizing them, not giving them pest control, and then seeing which ones can actually perform in the conditions that I already have. And the next step beyond that is hybridizing different varieties that show some promise, and that often completely transforms their performance. And beyond that, you can do wide hybridization of wild species to create entirely new crops. And if you look at the history of agriculture, pretty much every crop that we have has hybrid origins. So wheat, for example, is a three-way hybrid between wild grasses that still grow in the Middle East, and they've got little tiny seeds, like they're barely edible. But this chance series of hybridizations led to them transforming and forming what is the real foundation for a city like Babylon. It's not writing, it's not metalwork, it's not priests. It's a random hybrid that happened under a set of probably climactically chaotic conditions around 11,000 years ago when the world was changing. And we're heading into another period of change. So rather than relying on random hybrids, why don't we learn how to make them deliberately? And this might sound really fanciful, but this kind of thing is still happening today in living memory. So around me in subtropical Australia, there's 4 tiny populations of wild macadamia nut species. So the Aborigines used to eat them, but they were just an occasional treat. They were these obscure native plants that nobody knew anything about. And then about 100 years ago, a collector got 2 of them and happened to grow them side by side in their garden. And they hybridized, and that made the foundation for a multi-million-dollar macadamia nut industry, and a treat that everybody, almost everybody loves macadamia nuts. So it's the kind of thing that can happen really, really rapidly.
Okay, interesting. So with this project, what is your main long-term goal for, let's localize it to yourself, but also for your community and then for the world?
Yeah, so for myself on my farm, I'm trying to put together a suite of crops and livestock and the systems for using them that produce reliably, not just vegetables and fruit, but like the whole diet without relying on inputs coming from off the farm. So, and in my area, it went from hunter-gatherer to industrial farming with pretty much nothing in between. So I'm kind of reinventing that pre-industrial form of agriculture more or less from scratch, whereas other parts of the world can tap into, older tradition. Though if the climate keeps changing, then maybe they'll have to start from scratch as well too. So that's my personal goal. The book that I've written, which is called Taming the Apocalypse, is basically just kind of like a manifesto. It's only 30,000 words long, and it's just an exploration and an inspiration to try and convince more people to go down this route of breeding their own crops, of domesticating new crops, and thinking about the possibilities of where hands-on biotechnology that anybody can do could lead us in the future.
Awesome. You've mentioned a few times now this seemingly inevitable apocalypse coming. And I, as well as any other people who pay any sort of attention to political and actual climate in the world, can see that there is a threat of this. Now, I'm not a believer in without some external force coming in, such as nuclear war or a solar flare or something like that. I'm not necessarily one that believes in like an instant collapse, but I do see the possibility of a long, drawn out, slow collapse. Now, where do you fall on that spectrum?
I love the term the great simplification that Nate Hagens is pushing, that our hyper-complex, hyper-global system is going to simplify and localize steadily over time. And in many ways, this has kind of been happening since, well, depending on the metrics you look at, as far back as the 1970s, this complex society has come under increasing strain. The idea that a single middle-class wage could like buy a house and a car and feed a family and holidays and all these kind of luxuries that was the norm back in the 50s and 60s, that's steadily eroded already. So I don't think this is something that's going to happen in the future. I think we're already living through it. And for many of us, our entire life has been part of this steady, slow process. And undoubtedly, there will be the occasional dramatic event that comes along that catches everyone's attention. But I think it's the slow creep that is the real change. And I mean, that's the tricky thing with storytelling and like movies. It's the giant lizard chasing people that gets everyone's attention. The idea that there's 5 millimeters less rain every year over 100 years. How do you turn that into a story? Like humans have particular psychological structures that you have to try and tap into. And it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. Now, the real question is, do you think this localization that you've mentioned is net positive or net negative?
Ooh, I think it depends on the person and the time in history. So right now, for example, like I've just spent the last, I don't know, probably 2 months, if I added up all of the work, growing a maize crop, like a flour corn crop down on my creek flats by hand, special variety that I've bred, like all manual work. And if everything goes well, I'll probably get like 4 months, maybe 6 months worth of calories back from that. So it's a net positive. But right now in history, I could go down to the animal feed shop and buy that much corn for like $20. So if you it depends on your values. So if all you care about is making the most of your time in terms of dollars, I'm completely insane. But if there is a future out there where people can't go down and buy it for that price, or at any price maybe, and even more critically, can't get their hands on the right genetics for the crop that's capable of growing here without all sorts of heroic interventions, then money means nothing under those circumstances. And the path
Hmm.
from today to that hypothetical future, who knows how long and how winding it's going to be. I may never get to see any of that. But I want to at least do that foundational work while it's possible. Because if I have a crop failure, I don't starve. I go to the shop and I buy a bag of rice and life continues on.
Yeah.
That may not be an option forever. So yeah, I see myself as a lunatic pioneer in this area.
All pioneers are lunatics, right? But we
Mm.
can't get anywhere without them. I had a very interesting, similar experience to what you just mentioned. My wife and I have a modest HOA house, and we've got a little backyard with some grass. And so, a couple years ago, I spent a couple weekends, a few hours every day, and I dug up a section of grass, and I went to the store, and I spent couple $100 on pavers and some fertilizer and all this stuff, and I planted a bunch of carrots and a bunch of stuff. And all in, let's just say that I was 20 hours of labor and $200 in. I don't know exactly, something like that. And at the end of the season, I got a crop of about $3 worth of carrots.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I have literally experienced what you're describing. So my question for you is, how can the average person start this?
Ooh, okay. So the average person has very limited space and time and resources. And see, like, I'm very much focused on staple crops, but for the average person, the return on investment is way too low. So, like, if you were growing flour corn, for example, you'd get even less value back. So, for staple crops, I would leave that to weirdos like me, people who have too much time and too much space and too much determination for their own good a lot of the time. So, if you're working in a small space, I would focus on growing herbs first, because the quality difference between homegrown herbs and the ones you buy in the shop, night and day for anything that needs to be fresh. Likewise with leafy greens. And I would focus on varieties that give you a long season. A lot of the crops that you can buy seeds of are for market gardeners that crop all at once. So think broccoli, you get that one big head, you pick it, and end of the story. Whereas if you plant something leafy like a kale, you get a continuous crop over sometimes years for certain varieties. With broccoli, it's designed for transport. So when you buy broccoli in the shop, it's not as good as homegrown, but it's not dreadful if it's been moved pretty quickly. Whereas something flimsy like a kale leaf, it wilts as soon as you pick it on the farm. Like, it's really, really difficult to buy that in a shop at premium quality. So yeah, that would be my advice. Start on herbs and leafy greens. And they are often varieties that grow with very little inputs and few pests. Play around with different species and find the ones that actually like your conditions, rather than feeling determined that I must grow kale because Shane said grow kale. I would say plant 10 different species of leafy vegetables and see which ones actually want to grow for you, and then learn to cook with them.
Okay. I've seen recently a great interest in my generation, also in my life, of people who want to grow their own food in their own garden, and have chickens and stuff like that. And I think there is a value to that, both health wise and financially, and perhaps in communion with the earth that we live on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that we need everybody in the world, or a very high percentage of people, maybe 75 to 90% of people, to do this in order to have a sustainable environment?
I'm going to be a contrarian here and say absolutely not. So if you are a person who is attracted to gardening and you do it and you find you enjoy it, wonderful. But that isn't everybody. And given this is more likely to be a slowly creeping kind of process, I think the majority of people living in cities and dense suburbs are better off focusing on other sets of skills. So, for example, learning to cook from scratch. Like, how many people can take a bag of dry beans and a pile of like leg bones and turn that into a delicious soup? That is a far more valuable skill for the majority of people. And I would also point out that a lot of the transformation that we need to get our heads around is cultural and social. And people in dense cities are usually in a better position to focus on those aspects of adaptation, rather than just, growing another handful of carrots. I mean, I'm in the middle of
Awesome.
nowhere, so
Well,
that social side of thing for me, I can do a bit of it through online interactions, but my community is very small and very scattered. Whereas someone in a
mhm.
city has much more opportunity to play around with those aspects.
Yeah. And also much less room to grow stuff anyway. Like I
Yeah,
said, I've got a modest HOA house and can't do much anyway.
there's a chance that
Cool.
the topsoil was scraped when it was built, and that even a master gardener would struggle to do anything with it.
Yeah, you know, the house that I have here, as well as when I was growing up and living in my parents' house, they're both very clay ridden soils.
Hmm.
So it's very hard for plants to get in the clay and get their roots down. So we've kind of gone to having raised garden beds, which, you know, it's not ideal, but
Huge
it
upfront
works.
cost, which may or may not pay off.
Yeah, exactly. In the case of carrots, definitely not.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for example, I grew carrots and I bred carrots for multiple years on my cracking clay. And because our summers are so hot and wet that they just melt, I have to sow them in the autumn and they flower in the spring. And after doing that for several years, they were starting to adapt and I was getting a bit of a crop. But then I sat down one day and I looked at the amount of work that was involved compared to what I was getting compared to other crops. And I just abandoned the project. It wasn't worth continuing. And that's the key part of this style of gardening is giving things a go, but then actually weighing up if they're returning more than you're investing.
Hmm. Awesome.
Mm.
All right. Well, I told you that we were going to come around to this vulnerable part of the conversation.
Oh,
So
yes.
tell me, why did you transition from writing fiction to nonfiction?
Okay, so bit of context. I had been working on the farm full time for about 5 years, and due to a series of a couple events, I was approaching motivational burnout. And because I have a herd of dairy goats, I can't like just go and sit on a beach for 2 weeks. I'm chained to the farm. So what I did, I didn't grow any veggies. I just left all my trees. I just looked after the goats and did nothing else. And I took a holiday into my imagination and took the time to write this story. It took me probably a year and a half through various false starts in the beginning to get the thing done. And because it was an idea that had been rattling around in my head for years, I'd gone looking for this kind of book and I couldn't find it anywhere and I wanted to read it. So it has to be me, I guess. And yeah, that gave me enough time away from worrying about the farm and the world to just focus on this story and immerse myself in it. And I, I achieved my goal. I finished. I think Brandon Sanderson said the bottleneck between people who say they want to write a novel and the ones who finish a draft is actually more severe than the difference between finishing the draft and actually becoming a semi-successful author.
Hmm.
And I think he's probably right. Like for every person who finishes a novel, there's probably 1,000 people who've like seriously entertained it but never actually made a serious go of it. So anyway,
Yeah.
I'm proud of myself for finishing it. It became the thing that I wanted it to be. Like I achieved my goal. I went through the self-publishing journey because I figured this was such a weird story and a weird format. And I also wanted to be familiar with the self-publishing ecosystem. So if I did ever try traditional publishing, I would have a comparison. So if I didn't like the deal that I was being offered, I could say, oh, well, it'll just take me a few weeks and I'll do it myself. And you will know what I'm in
Yeah.
for. So I think it's useful to try both. And I put it out. I got a bit of sales, nothing spectacular, but I didn't do a lot in terms of promotion. I didn't do any paid promotion, not really, not the usual stuff that you're told to do. I did as many podcasts as I could get on because I love podcasts. I tried doing the Twitter thing. I hate Twitter. I hate Facebook. It just didn't work for me at all, but I'm sure it works for other people. And, sales petered away and I'm like, okay, that's it. And I always thought that was a possibility. It's a very strange book. It's hard to market it to sci-fi people who expect to see a spaceship on the cover. People don't quite know how to take it. Even designing the covers was a fun process. Like, how do you
Hmm.
visually communicate biological science fiction? It's a genre that doesn't quite exist. By comparison, like Adrian Tchaikovsky's covers are a planet and a spaceship with a slightly greenish tinge, but it has spaceships in it, so that's honest marketing. I couldn't do that. I had no recognizable technology, so that kind of made things challenging. But I'm very happy with the way the covers turned out. But anyway, so I entered in the self-published science fiction competition. Didn't make it through the first cut. The feedback I got was that it was very well written, but they just didn't know what to make of it. Like they were kind of weirded out by it.
Hmm.
But that's okay. So I now look on that novel as a training experience. I'm better at writing long-form fiction. I understand the self-publishing market. I know that I can do my own covers if I have to. I've got kind of a sense of the challenge of marketing. So maybe, look at it this way. I figure by the time you get to your fifth book, paying for marketing has a better potential return on investment because you're more likely to get people going into your back catalog. This first book I look on as back catalog. And because it's so weird and so niche, it's never going to be replicated. It's not like just some throwaway cozy romance where there's thousands of them that come out every month. That if it doesn't strike immediately, then you've lost your investment. So there's a chance that in the future that people will go looking for stories like this. And I bring up an example of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So when that was first published, his literary friends read it and go, oh, that's really lovely, but weird. And it's like, is this for children? Is it a fairy tale? Like, what are we supposed to do with this? And it sat around like that for a long time until the counterculture of the 60s and the 70s picked up on it as embodying their anti-war, anti-nuclear protests. Like Mordor was the Vietnam War. It was nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And it got popularized through Dungeons and Dragons. And it was the seed for pretty much the whole fantasy genre to grow around. So maybe in another 10 or 20 years, if I'm still around, I'll get to see it. If the world gets more desperate and people become more aware of the challenges facing us, maybe they'll go looking for alternate stories about where the future could take us.
Yeah. Well, full circle, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, pioneers are always looked upon as a little crazy. So maybe you're just ahead of your time.
Hopefully. Better than being late.
And one final comment on that. I don't think there's anything wrong with writing for just art. I think a lot of people take book writing as a business. And if you want it to be a business, you're going to have to treat it like a business. You have to write full time. You're going to have to hire people to help you with the things you can't do. You're going to have to market it. You can't write art and expect it to perform like a business the same way that you shouldn't go in trying to write art. Well, I just lost my train of thought. You should write art if you want to write art. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. I would point out as well, too, that writing your first book is going to be the most challenging one in terms of maintaining motivation. So if you have a genuine passion for the idea in the story and you're doing it for yourself, you're much more likely to reach the finish line. That might compromise it being easy to market, but nobody should write one novel thinking that that's going to be their breakout success. And if you look at the people that happens to, it usually ends up being a poisoned chalice because they have no idea about how to harness that momentum and carry it forward. They usually end up being a one-hit wonder. And then they scramble to kind of chase the market when they don't know how to do it properly. And it all blows up in their face. I would recommend if you're starting out thinking about writing, particularly self-publishing, write for yourself for the first novel. And you can always tune your future works to make them more marketable, to kind of move in that direction once you have a sense of your workflows and your routines and you know that it's something that you can complete.
Awesome. Well, you have brought me a lot of wisdom, both in regards to sustainability, the future of the planet, and publishing. So, any final words before I let you go?
I would maybe just... Here's a really interesting tidbit that I'm telling everyone that I see. So, did you know that Amazon makes more money selling paid advertising to self-published authors than the self-published authors make selling their books in aggregate? And if you're Amazon, that's your business model. You're not a bookstore, you're an advertising platform. Really.
Yeah.
Logistics is part of it, but advertising is most of it. And if you think about it, that's a perfect example of an economic equilibrium, because if you can spend $1 on advertising and make $1.10 back, why wouldn't you do that? Except if everyone does that, the profit shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until you're getting 1 cent back with a risk of losing the whole dollar. So Amazon wins either way, but for the self-published authors, the access to the audience has been basically parasitized by these giant mega corporations. And I'm hopeful that sometime in the future that an alternate model comes around, and just an idea that I'm throwing out into the universe, I think that large language model AIs could actually be the tool that does this. So imagine if you had an LLM, like GPT, one of those, that was trained on a particular reader's tastes. Like if you gave it 10 novels and said, this is what this particular person loves to read, now go and read, every chapter summary, like every sample chapter on Amazon, and bring me the 100 best books that accord with those tastes. No need for advertising, no need for Amazon to make a cut on the top. It would disintermediate the artist and the audience. And I think that's an unappreciated potential power of AI to, use AI to filter through all of the crap that AI is helping us create.
Well, I think you just came up with $1 billion idea, and you heard it first here on this podcast. So
yeah, if you're a tech bro in Silicon Valley, do it. Like I'm not a computer programmer kind of person, but I can see this potential, and I just want it to exist in the world and break the internet. I mean, that's the business model of the internet. It's an advertising platform. And if AIs take away the need to advertise, then maybe we'll get our internet back.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on my podcast, everybody. We have Shane Simonson / Haldane B. Doyle.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely.